I'm your host for the evening, Tim Eubanks, and this is the Bucklesberry Lemonade Podcast. Tonight's episode, well, it's simply called Unsolved True Crime Cases from the South's Past, where the past doesn't rest. First up, we have a serial killer who wore a white mask, and then a bank robbery where the wrong men, or just maybe the right men, paid the price. The third case, well, that's a terror that stalked the elderly, all within a 1-mile radius. And our last story, well, it's a doozy. It's all about a body found in a suitcase, and it's never been solved. But let's start where the terror all started, on the border of Texas and Arkansas. Let's go all the way back to 1946. If you grew up anywhere near the Arkansas-Texas border, you've probably heard the stories, not whispered around campfires, but spoken very plainly, the way people talk about storms that they've survived. Because in the spring of 1946, Texarkana stopped being just a town. It became a hunting ground. Texarkana back then, just like today, sat split right down the middle. Half in Texas, half in Arkansas. A railroad town. Working people. Church on Sunday. Friday night, well, that's football. And like towns everywhere back then, teenagers, they had their spots. Quiet dirt roads, lovers' lanes, places just far enough from town to feel private and just close enough to feel safe. But that illusion, it didn't last long. On the night of February 22nd, 1946, Jimmy Hollis and Mary Jean Laurie, they were parked on a secluded road just outside Texarkana. They were talking and laughing, planning nothing more dangerous than maybe just a kiss. Then someone knocked on the window. A man stood there. He was wearing a mask, white cloth, cut with eye holes. In one hand a flashlight, in the other a gun. And he ordered Jimmy out of the car. And Jimmy, being scared, complied. The man told him not to look back, and then, without warning, he pistol-whipped Jimmy so violently that blood poured down his face. Jimmy stumbled into the darkness, blinded, certain he was about to die. The masked man turned to Mary Jean, and he assaulted her brutally, and then vanished into the woods. Both Jimmy and Mary Jean survived. And for a brief, terrible moment, people hoped it was just a one-off. But it wasn't. Less than 2 months later, on March 24th, 1946, Paul Martin and Betty Jo Booker went missing after a night out. Now, Paul was found first. He'd been shot multiple times. His body dumped by the roadside. Now, Betty Jo's body, well, she was discovered hours later, nearly 2 miles away. She had been shot as well. Her saxophone case, well, it laid nearby. Texarkana began to panic. 2 lovers, 2 murders, no robbery, no known motive, and no known suspect. And now everyone was looking over their shoulder. Then on April 13th, 1946, the killer struck again. This time, he broke the rules. Instead of the local lover's lane, he walked straight into someone's home. Virgil and Katie Starks. They were asleep when the killer forced his way in. Virgil was shot twice in the face. was still in his own bed. Now, Katie ran. She ran barefoot, bleeding, screaming for help as the killer fired after her. Katie survived, but Virgil did not. Now the message was clear. No place was safe. You weren't safe in your car. You weren't safe in your home. You weren't safe in the daylight. And now you weren't safe asleep. Now the last known attack came on May 3rd, 1946. Virgil and Katie were dead or alive by chance. But this time, the killer may have showed mercy or maybe hesitation, and then again maybe something worse. A man and a woman were attacked. The man was shot. The woman survived. And then the phantom stopped. Just like that. A town under siege. Texarkana became something straight out of a nightmare. Men armed themselves. Curfews went into effect, and gun sales exploded. Parents began to escort their children everywhere. Police worked hard around the clock, but they were always behind. The killer, well, he left no fingerprints, no witnesses who saw his face. There was no clear pattern beyond couples and terror. There was constant media coverage of the increased police activity. And on May 5th, the Texarkana Gazette, the local newspaper, well, they stated that the killer could strike again at any moment, at any place, and at anyone. And for a week, police were flooded with reports of prowlers. One tired officer stated that nearly all the alarm was the result of excitement, wild imagination, and near hysteria. Maybe it's just me, but the idea that you've got a serial killer running around in your backyard, that might could cause some excitement, some wild imagination, and I'm pretty sure some near hysteria. Now at this point, the phantom killer had crawled inside the town's head. There were suspects, but they weren't answers. Police questioned hundreds. One man, Yul Sweeney, well, he became the prime suspect. He was noted as being a violent criminal, a liar, a man whose own wife claimed he had confessed. But there was no physical evidence. No weapon was found at his home or in his car. There was no mask, no proof. And so Sweeney was never charged. And the murders were never solved. The Phantom Killer faded into legend, but not into history. The case inspired movies, including the 1976 cult classic, The Town That Dreaded Sundown, which in all honesty scared little Timmy a lot back in the day. It inspired books, campfire tales, but for the families, there was no legend. Just empty chairs, closed caskets, and unanswered questions. Was the killer local? Maybe a transient just traveling through? Perhaps a veteran who couldn't quite come home from the war? Or possibly a man who blended perfectly into the local church pews and grocery lines? No one really knows. And that might be the most terrifying part of all. Because the Phantom Killer, he didn't just leave town. He just stopped. Now, Texarkana, it eventually returned to normal. But if you walk those roads at night, if you sit long enough where the trees close in and the light fades, you'll understand something the locals never forgot. Fear doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes knocks softly. Sometimes it wears a mask, and sometimes it never gets caught. Stay tuned, guys. Next up, we'll head to North Carolina for a true crime tale from 1933. And now we head to North Carolina for a true crime tale from 1933. Now, this particular heist, well, this one went spectacularly wrong. And this story isn't about professional outlaws. This is about desperation and a deadly mistake. This is the story of a botched job that became a major wrongful conviction case. Maybe. It's the attempted robbery of the Merchants and Farmers Bank in Taylorsville, North Carolina. Taylorsville is a small town, about 80 miles from High Point, where our four protagonists hailed from. Our players, they're a small, tight-knit crew, mostly family. Bascom Green, his son Lester, his son-in-law Ed Black, and a close friend named Mike Stefanoff. They were desperate men, driven by the grinding poverty of the Depression. They had planned the robbery for one day, but they actually postponed it because police were in town for a funeral. Just a moment of hesitation that speaks volumes about their amateur status. But on July 29th, 1933, they went through with the robbery. They hit that bank hard, but from the beginning, the job was a complete mess. During the chaos, gunfire erupted. The cashier, T.C. Barnes, unfortunately, T.C. was tragically shot and died. And the assistant cashier, Solon Little, was wounded but did survive. The robbers didn't make a clean escape, though. Well, if they did, the trail of witnesses was strong enough to say otherwise. And within days, the Green family men and their friend Stefanoff were caught, convicted, and sentenced to 15 years. Case closed. Right? Maybe not. But this is where that trace comes in. The nagging, unsettling doubt that made this case a legend of injustice. You see, the local community and the newspaper, they were all satisfied. The guilty men were caught, but the men themselves maintained their innocence regarding the murder. In other words, we did the crime, but we didn't commit the murder. Then in 1934, just a year after the heist, Mike Stefanoff, one of the convicted robbers, Mike was on his deathbed in what became his final shocking testament. He confessed everything about the robbery. Everything. But he swore, absolutely swore, that they were all completely innocent of the murder. He claimed they had been framed for the fatal shooting of the cashier, T.C. Barnes. This deathbed confession, it launched a whole new investigation. It turns out the initial case was rife with false testimony and at best circumstantial evidence. Eventually, the surviving men, Bascom Green, Lester Green, and Ed Black, were exonerated. Their convictions were overturned. So here is the final unsolved knot of it all. If the four convicted and later exonerated men did not fire the fatal shot, then who exactly killed T.C. Barnes? The official records say the men were cleared, but the identity of the true shooter, the person who pulled the trigger that ended the cashier's life in the chaos of that desperate summer morning, well, he was never discovered. The state dropped the charges, admitting their mistake. But the question of who fired the bullet, that became a permanent, chilling, unsolved murder in the very heart of North Carolina's history. All right, guys, now we head over to story number 3. We'll leave North Carolina and head over to Columbus, Mississippi. This is the story of the Columbus elderly strangulations. Stay tuned.
Well, my darlings, we shall return after a brief message from our sponsor.
This is Lisa from Bucklesberry Lemonade. We're so glad you joined us. Please hit the like and subscribe button and comment where you're listening from.
We now join our regularly scheduled programming already in progress.
Columbus, Mississippi. It's the kind of town that moves at a different speed. Front porches, familiar faces, streets where nothing much happens after dark. And if it does, everybody hears about it by the morning. That's why when the first body was found, they assumed it was a tragedy. When the second body was found, they assumed a coincidence. But by the time the third body appeared, fear began to settle in like humidity. Between 1996 and 1998, 5 elderly residents of Columbus, all living alone, all within roughly a 1-mile radius, were found dead inside their own homes. 4 had been strangled, none were robbed, and none had signs of a forced entry. These weren't people who took risks. They weren't out late. They weren't meeting strangers. They were supposed to be safe. They had names. Louise Randall. She was 80. Miss Betty Everett. Miss Everett was 68. Lauren Wilbanks. That good sir was 75 years old. Robert Hanna, 61. And Mac Fowler. Mr. Fowler was 78 years old. Neighbors described them as quiet, routine, and predictable. The kind of people who wave through the window but rarely answer the door after sunset. Yet someone got inside. Not once, but every time. Investigators, they quickly noticed a pattern. No valuables missing. No ransacking. No signs of struggle spilling into the rooms. This wasn't a robbery gone wrong. This was deliberate. Someone came in, moved with purpose, and left without disturbing the house at all. What makes it worse, well, practically unbearable, was how close it all was. 1 mile. That's it. 1 mile. You could stand in the middle of the cluster and walk to each victim's home in under 20 minutes. The killer didn't need a car. They didn't need to plan an escape route. It seems they were already home. Residents began locking doors earlier, sitting in the dark, leaving lights on all night long. And still, nothing changed. Police brought in outside help, serial crime analysts, behavioral specialists, and they asked all the right questions. Why the elderly? Why was nothing stolen? Why such restraint? One theory, it suggested control. The strangulation requires proximity, time, and calm. Another suggested whoever the perpetrator was familiar with everyone, that the victims may have opened the doors willingly. And that is a scary thought. But no one could prove it, and no suspect ever surfaced. Then it suddenly stopped, just as quickly as it started. There were no arrests, no press conferences, no explanation. The killer didn't escalate, didn't taunt, didn't confess. They simply disappeared back into town or from wherever. Today, the case remains unsolved. And in Columbus, Mississippi, the fear never really left. It just learned how to live quietly, because when a killer targets the elderly, it breaks the unspoken rule. It tells a town that even in the last years of life, you aren't protected. And that the person responsible may still be walking those same streets, moving at the same slow pace as everyone else. Well, let's move from Mississippi and pray that that terror never returns. And let's head over to South Carolina. The following story involves an unidentified man found inside a suitcase. You know, it seems highways don't remember people. They tend to erase them. And that's what makes this next case so unsettling. On November 14th, 1968, two boys walking through a wooded area near Interstate 26 in Newberry County, South Carolina, they stumbled onto something that didn't belong there. A suitcase. It was old, worn, heavy, and nearby, another bag. But inside that suitcase, there were human remains, dismembered, carefully packed, wrapped and concealed with effort that suggested time, planning, and distance. Investigators believe the body had been hidden for months, not dumped in a panic, but definitely transported there. The victim was a white male, estimated to be between 35 and 55 years old, medium build, well cared for. He did have an old injury in one of his fingers, something that might have come from years of work or a long forgotten accident, but there was no identification. They couldn't find any missing person reports, no name. This poor soul eventually became known as the Newberry County John Doe. Sometimes, though, he's been referred to as the Traveler. This wasn't a crime of convenience. The killer, or possibly killers, well, they had gone to extraordinary lengths. 2 pieces of luggage deep in the remote woods. Well, just far enough off the interstate to be hidden, I guess, but close enough to suggest movement. This man likely met his end somewhere else. Maybe another town, another state, another life entirely. And when the Traveler was found, there was nothing left to trace him back home. Police canvassed hotels. They went to truck stops, and they even combed through employment records. Nothing. It seems no one was looking for him, which meant one of 2 things. Either he had no one, or it being 1968, whoever knew him believed he might have already been gone. The cause of death couldn't be determined. Time had erased too much. But homicide was definitely obvious. I mean, people don't dismember themselves and pack themselves neatly into a suitcase. The Traveler was buried, given a case number, and left behind by history. There were no breakthroughs, no DNA matches, no neat pristine letter arriving decades later to explain it all. No. We're left with just a man who crossed the South and vanished between the exits. Highways are full of ghosts. People passing through. People starting over. People running from something no one else can see. And sometimes, when those lives end violently, there's nothing left to anchor them to this world. By now, there's no name, no memory, just a suitcase in the woods and the sound of traffic passing by, never slowing down. Every now and again in the South, violence doesn't always announce itself with sirens or screams. Sometimes it arrives quietly and leaves nothing behind but questions. I'm your host, Tim Eubanks. Thank you for listening to the Bucklesberry Lemonade podcast. And until next time, please remember to lock your doors. Turn on your porch lights. Hug a loved one. And stay safe out there.